Now, to get back to the Indigenous voice, Mark Liebler is a distinguished Australian in the law, in the Jewish community, and for his work at a high level on Indigenous affairs. When it comes to Indigenous recognition, he served on and chaired bodies like the Expert Panel and the Referendum Council, appointed by Liberal and Labor governments in Canberra. And his firm is now weighing in on the Indigenous voice and the current report before the government asking for public support and feedback on that. And he suggested that the voice should be mandated in the Constitution. Mark Liebler joins me now live from Melbourne. Good to talk to you, Mark. I've always got to point out when I talk about these issues that I'm on the government's senior advisory committee on the co-design, but I'm interested in your response after your long experience in these matters. You'd be happy to see the work done towards a voice, but you believe that there should be constitutional mandate for that voice.
Yes, thanks, Chris. Good to be here. Look, I think the important thing about the proposal for constitutional recognition, the voice, is that it's the only proposal that has come out that has been pretty much unanimously supported by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians over the most proportionately large dialogue and consultation that's ever been held. So it's an oxymoron to suggest that we're going to recognise Indigenous Australians in a way that they don't want to be recognised. This is what they want. And therefore, I think it's important that this is the direction in which we have to head. I think, by the way, that the committee on which you serve, which is headed by Marcia Langton and Tom Calma, both of whom I have the highest regard for, have done a wonderful job in teasing out what this body needs to look like. But to in any way overlook the need for constitutional recognition is, I think, ultimately a recipe for disaster.
I think you touch on a very important point, because anyone who knows the history of the Indigenous struggle here knows how difficult it is to get consensus. If you think mainstream politics is divided and factionalised, get into some Indigenous politics. And the fact that you got consensus around this idea and this model at Uluru was truly a breakthrough, and so that's a powerful point you make. But Prime Minister Scott Morrison has tried to be very clear. He wants to do constitutional recognition over here and look at a legislated voice over here. And it's difficult to do because the idea of the voice came up through the push for constitutional recognition. Look,
the Prime Minister, for whom I have a great deal of respect, is a very pragmatic politician. There is a huge support base growing for the Uluru Statement from the heart, the centrepiece of which is the voice to Parliament. And he's going to take notice. I think politicians from all sides of Parliament are going to take notice. And at the end of the day, I believe that this will happen. Even polling to date, without any total consensus among politicians, has indicated strong support amongst the community. I've said from day one that the Leader of the Opposition needs to go hand in hand with the Prime Minister in supporting this, and the referendum will pass. And the other thing, Chris, is let's not forget this proposal is a conservative construct. It doesn't come from the left. It's a conservative construct, and there's absolutely no reason why both sides of Parliament can't ultimately support it. But it will take time, and these things don't happen overnight.
No, they don't. And there's a lot of people who watch this channel and this program who get pretty cranky at me when I advocate for this idea. That's right. It's a free society. Everyone would get a vote eventually. But I think it's an important point you make. There's quite a bit of momentum for this in the community now. Broad support on the right of politics and the left of politics and across Indigenous communities. So if it was consolidated and there was some public advocacy from a government, you would have thought that this is a reform that is achievable.
You know, Chris, it is so easy. I mean, this is an advisory body which has no power to interfere with the parliamentary processes. It's an advisory power which can't be contested in any court for any reason whatsoever. All of the decisions in terms of how the body would be operating would be made not in the Constitution, but by the Parliament itself. So when you look at all of that, you've got to ask yourself, why should there be any opposition to this at all? When you look at the history of, you know, our Indigenous Australians, when you look at, you know, there was an invasion. We didn't occupy this country by consent. We started off by murdering them. Then some would argue that, you know, we did them a lot of damage by kindness. And then finally we realised that, you know, very late in the piece that we had to work together. And what do they want? A voice to the Parliament, an advisory body which would not be justiciable, which would not interfere, would not be subject to the judges' interference, would not be subject to Parliament's interference. I just can't think of anything that's more eminently reasonable than that, if you want to think about it. And by the way, it's something that has been supported by 2 former Chief Justices of the High Court.
Just finally and briefly, Mark Liebler, though, why must it be in the Constitution in your view?
I'll tell you why. Because our Indigenous Australians want it in the Constitution. They regard this as a substantive form of constitutional recognition, which would mean that the body itself can't be abolished, as ATSIC was. But notwithstanding that it can't be abolished, every aspect of its operation would be determined by the Parliament.
Well argued, Mark. Good to have you on the program.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
Mark Liebler there, a great Australian, and his voice will be listened to in Canberra. I know many of you disagree with me, but I tell you what, if you want reconciliation in this country, you can't just fob off what Indigenous Australians want. We've got to do things better. We haven't done things so brilliantly so far that we can just keep doing what we've been doing for decades.